So with the latest SUP for the Alexa Mini LF, how long has this been in development? Was this an update that was planned prior to even the camera getting released, that you were going to put these S35 modes in there and extended large format modes as well?
No, it wasn't actually. We're always planning new updates, because what we see is, we always have new ideas, and then there's lots of feedback from the market that comes. So there's always things people want, always things we can do to improve the camera. But we had assumed that, we would have the new Super 35 camera by now, and that would take care of the Super 35 need. However, then a lot of people said, well, even when the Super 35 camera comes, I still want to have the Super 35 modes available for the Mini LF. And it was just a massive amount of requests, surprisingly massive amount of requests for that. And so we said, okay, we'll do whatever the customer wants. And we started the software update, the 7.
And so this there's been some beta testing going on.
Or let's say that the 7 was scheduled anyway, and then we decided what would be the content of the 7.
And this has been beta tested for a few months now, or I guess maybe even a little bit longer. What has the feedback been from people who've been beta testing it?
Fred?
In the beginning, we had 2 phases of beta test. So in the beginning, we did a closed beta test where we contacted customers that we know, and we wanted to keep it like a little bit a limited number of people. So that were I think 10, 15 customers from around the world who were testing. And that in that time, I think we started in February this year, so 2 months prior to the release. And that really helped us understanding what's happening. They also found a few bugs, and they were reported, so we were able to fix them. And then a month ago, so a month prior to the release, we started doing an open beta. That was end of March when we started. And now everyone from the field could register to that beta test and could download the software. We obviously said it's for testing and evaluation purposes only, but you can say that as a manufacturer and people don't care. So we heard that some people were using that on short projects as well. And that also really helped us. They came back with a lot of questions for the functionality. So that first of all helped us improving the documentation and explanation. And here and there, we also found a few bugs that we could fix. And overall, that really helped us improving the system stability of the camera and of the software, because it's just so many people having that installed on their cameras. And we found a few things like with updating the software to the camera that we could improve. So that was very, very helpful and very valuable to do.
And just run me through some of the key new features that are in the SUP update, just in case people are not aware of what they are.
So the main features of the SUP 7 are the new recording formats. We have 4 Super 35 recording formats that we have now included. They were already established with the Alexa cameras for quite a while. So that are not new formats. They are already in the industry and in use. And then we had one request, or not one request, many people requested that they also want to have a 16:9 that uses the full width of the large format sensor. So that are the 2 new large format recording formats. So we're using nearly the full width of the sensor, and then are doing a downsampling either to UHD, so 3840 by 2160 in resolution, by keeping the same field of view, or we do a downsample to HD from that nearly full width. So these are the 6 new recording formats that we have. Then we have improved the magnification status. So that is a monitoring feature. And then we have improved the number and amount of frame lines that we have on the camera. Let me check my notes. There are a few other things.
There are many, many new frame lines people want. It's getting a little crazy. And then there are many, many anamorphic lenses. And there are no people who want the difference between 1.30 and 1.33 D-squeeze, which you can't see. Optics are not being built. But who am I to say? So we between all these formats people want, and all the combination of formats and D-squeeze ratios just makes for a huge number of frame lines. So we increased the maximum number, I think, from 100 to 256.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, I
then we
read that
have,
and I thought, geez, isn't 100 already enough?
that's what we thought, but then certainly for the open gate formats, where then anybody can do whatever they want, I made this long list of all combinations, all sensical combinations of frame lines and D-squeeze ratios, and it just became a long list. There weren't a lot of spaces left for custom frame lines. That's why we said, okay, we gotta, yeah, it's getting crazy. And I've talked to people who said, look, I have to shoot for 16:9 because we're going to go to TV, and then my producer wants me to also protect for CinemaScope because he's an artiste, and then the other producer says I need to shoot for 1:1 for Instagram. How do you do how do you do that? It's crazy.
Yeah, and also what we found that another feature that I forgot that I should have mentioned that in the beginning, maybe Marc, you want to explain that briefly, is we found out that it's getting very confusing naming things. Well, Marc knows that for quite a while already, that it's complicated to name products and recording formats and frame lines. But now we have a camera that has large format recording options and Super 35 recording options. And some of the Super 35 recording options were already established as an open gate format, for example, but they are not open gate in an LF camera. So we came up with a new naming scheme. So Marc, maybe you want to go through that.
Right. Can you see my screen, Matt?
Yep, I can see your screen now.
Okay, so we have a new naming screen, which actually is very similar to what we used to have in the original Alexa. So first you have the recording codec, being Apple ProRes or ARRI RAW. Then you have the sensor mode, and the sensor mode essentially defines how many photo sites from the sensor do you capture, how large is the area on the sensor that you capture. And that defines what image circle lens you need, that defines the maximum frames per second and your data rate ultimately. And then the last part, the third part, is the recording file container size. What do we actually record? Because there are some formats where we're capturing one thing from the sensor. For instance, in the LF 16:9 format, we're capturing the full sensor width, but then we're downsampling it in the camera to something smaller. And then the sensor mode bit is, again, itself divided into 3 bits. First are the number of horizontal photo sites on the sensor. Then it is it large format or Super 35? And then is the aspect area of the area of the sensor that we're reading out. It becomes a little bit longer of a string, but you have all the information then in there to know what you're actually shooting.
Because that stuff can get quite confusing sometimes, and I think people sort of forget that obviously the resolution that you're using may not end up being the actual resolution that you're recording in the end.
Exactly, and it gets even more complicated. For instance, with a Mini, we have a format where we're actually doing a D-squeeze in camera from anamorphic, which, by the way, is hugely popular. But now you're recording something completely different from what you're capturing on the sensor. Even the aspect ratio is different between what's on the sensor and what you're recording. So that's the new name. I actually have do you have the release notes, Matt?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the release notes. So Fred already said expanded recording format names. Then we have the 4 new Super 35 recording formats, the new large format recording formats. We used to have an orange line to show when people did a magnification, and people really didn't like that at all. And so we removed the orange line, and now there's an icon that shows a little gray icon to not distract people from the main thing they're doing, which is looking at the image. We're supporting the signature zoom extender. What happens is when you put the signature zoom extender on the signature zoom or the signature prime 280, is the lens talks to the zoom extender, then zoom extender says, oh, hey, but I'm a zoom extender. And then the camera gets both of these bits of information and actually calculates the proper focal length and all the proper information. We talked about the default frame lines, more default frame lines, more frame lines possible in total. One other thing is that the user setup files used to be only available for user setup files from the same software version. And we now have found a way that the camera's gotten a lot smarter. It'll look at a user setup file and say, all right, this is an old user setup file, but these parameters and these parameters and these parameters pertain to me. And then it'll just take the parameters that pertain to this software version and ignore everything else. It's a lot more robust now. So you can feed it anything, and it takes whatever applies to that software version. And then there are a whole bunch of other little enhancements. The camera access protocol, that's mostly commands to remotely control the camera from some other device. It's mostly for future uses where we're planning. Then Fred, the LBus devices, do you have details on that?
Yeah, well, that is actually like a handshake. If you connect an LBus device to the camera, they will say hello, and the communication is a bit more stable in the beginning. I think that's what I understand from that.
Okay, and that also means that in the future, oh yeah, and that these two things. And that also means that the camera will say, hey, your new accessory, what do you do? And then the accessory will send its parameters, so we can release new accessories without always having to release new software versions on the camera. Improved log file exporting. We had a number of log files in the camera that we would ask people to download and send to us from the rentals, for instance. And what we've now done is the camera will actually take a whole bunch of log files and compress them into a zip file. And then the user gets just this one zip file that they can send to us. Another interesting one, power line communication. We've implemented in the camera now a protocol where the camera could communicate just over the two wires to a battery, a block battery on the ground. There are no block batteries that have power line communication, so this is one of those very hopeful things. But we're starting to talk to the battery manufacturers and saying, look, we have this available. Do you want to use this? Because the one thing we've seen, you know, I grew up with NiCad batteries, and they have this beautiful what's it called, discharge curve. You know, it just slowly goes down and down and down. You can say, okay, at this percentage of discharge, I'm going to give the user a warning. Well, with the current batteries, you have this flat plateau, and then boom, all of a sudden you have no more power. So you can't really say at so many volts, I give the user a warning. It doesn't work. So we're dependent on the batteries actually being smart enough to track how much power they have and then communicating that to us. We've done that with the onboard batteries. There's a protocol where a lot of the onboard battery manufacturers now communicate, or the batteries communicate with the camera. That works pretty well, but we don't have that with the block batteries that you connect via a cable to the camera. And this is an attempt on our part. You know, it's always a chicken and egg. So we're saying, look, we're gonna do this. We're gonna put this in the camera. It's available, and we're gonna give the information for free to anybody, and then they can do whatever they want, and hopefully maybe update their battery so they can talk to the camera. And I think that's it.
Is there any way of putting up, say, multiple frame lines at the same time? So you were talking about before, you know, maybe you had to deliver in 16:9 and 1:1 and some other format as well.
Yes, we updated.
Can you put multiple ones up on there that are different colored?
Yeah, this is actually something we did with the Alexa a while ago. You can put 3 different frame lines in at the same time, and the camera will remember all 3 and record all 3 in metadata. And the first one is a special one that is marked specially. And then if you go into something like the color front, what's it called? What's their daily system called? It's too early for me. Color front onset dailies, OSD, that's what it's called, onset dailies. If you go into something like their system, they can actually use that first frame line and crop the image based on the first frame line automatically. So, you know, we're trying to put all the metadata in there that people later on in the process can do more automated dailies processes. Same with the lookup tables. You know, we're sticking the actual lookup tables into the metadata. So in dailies creation, somebody could just say, just use the lookup table they were using on the set, and then that lookup table gets automatically applied to the image to speed up dailies creation.
And in terms of frame rates, are we sort of maxed out now on the Mini LF in terms of its capabilities of what you've been able to put into it, or is there room there going forward to do anything further?
There is not a lot of room to go any further because the interesting thing is when you're talking about frame rates, it's a very complicated subject because the bottleneck, depending on which format you're using, the bottleneck always ends up to be somewhere else. Sometimes it's recording media, sometimes it's the sensor, sometimes it's the Ethernet switch in the camera. It's just insane. It's very complicated. But what we have, so the camera itself probably will not go any faster than 100 frames a second because that's a limit on the sensor. There we go. Okay, so this is the chart. The green stuff is Mini LF. The blue stuff is the equivalent format on the Mini. Excuse me. The equivalent format on the Mini. And then the salmon colored stuff is the Alexa LF. So you can see that we're trying to make sure the Mini LF, shares some of the same formats as these other cameras. And what we've seen is that with the, let's go this guy here, the new ARRI RAW format. This is a 3.4K Super 35, what used to be Open Gate in the Mini. ARRI RAW format. On the Mini, we could do 30 frames a second. And on the Mini LF, we can do twice as much, 60 frames a second. And the beta testers specifically commented on that. They really liked that. 30 is not really a lot these days. And then in the two UHD formats, there's no equivalent to those, so they're just whatever they are, 48 and 75. And then the 3.2K, which is a very popular format in TV these days, we can also go faster than the Mini, 75. Same with the 2.8K, 50 to 75. And then the only place where we're slower is the Super 35 downscale to HD in the camera, which the Mini can do 200 and the Mini LF can do 100. And as I said, that's where we're bumping into the actual sensor limitation. Because when we went from the Alexa LF, which can do 150 max, to the Mini, the camera's half the size. So cooling is really the issue. You can do all the processing you want, but if the camera melts, nothing is gained. So we had to make sure we could find a way to cool this. And we did improve on the cooling system that's in the Mini, actually. We made, and it's really, little improvements now. A different way to have the radiator fin manufactured, a slightly different geometry in the radiator fin. The one radiator fin that's attached to this chip is a little bigger now. It's really fine-tuning and tweaking all the cooling system. That gave us a little more efficiency in the cooling, but also we had to reduce frames per second. And the sensor board takes a lot of power. So by making the sensor board smaller, we were able to fit it into the camera, but that also limited the maximum frames per second.
And just finally, I know you can't divulge any information, but how is the new camera, S35 camera, looking? Is it still on schedule to be released sometime this year?
Yes and no. It is still on schedule. I can tell you what we have officially, we've had lots of discussions internally, what can we say? Because we're being asked about this all the time. And this is what we can officially say, what has agreed with everyone, and which we've, I think, published on our own website as well. So the release plan is, and we've very carefully worked on the wording here, the camera will be available in volume early 2022. You notice that we're leaving ourselves a lot of space to come earlier or later, whatever happens. So in volume early 2022, we've already said it will have approximately the size and shape of the Alexa Mini. We've already said that it will use the same viewfinder as the Mini LF. It will be capable of using the same media as the Mini LF, so the codecs drives. We've said that it's a Super 35 4x3 4K sensor. So it's a tall sensor that's designed for anamorphic lenses as well as spherical lenses, not just a 16:9 sensor. And I'm looking here to the left because I got one on my desk here that I'm playing around with. I think, Fred, anything else that you can think of?
No, I think you basically covered the main
and the B mount, battery mount, will be the default battery mount, even though we are also allowing other battery mounts. We're in conversation with a whole bunch of battery manufacturers. We're doing a whole bunch of really scary things now. The first scary thing was introducing the LPL lens mount. Introducing a new standard is a very scary thing, because if nobody picks it up, you just stand there with a new standard and you look dumb. But the LPL mount seems to be very, very successful. We made it available to a lot of other manufacturers. Other lenses are using it now. There are third-party mounts for other cameras. So that's going well. That's on the front of the camera. And then on the back of the camera, one thing we saw is that cameras will need more power in the future. We're seeing this in our roadmap. Other manufacturers, I'm sure, are seeing the same thing. And so cameras, in my opinion, will all go 24 volts eventually. We already had to go 24 volts with the Alexa LF. And with the new camera will be a 24-volt camera, I can say this much. And so we have also introduced a new battery mount standard. That's the B mount. And in fact, Fred has been working on a new website that just went online 2 days ago, right, Fred?
Yeah, on Wednesday, yes.
Okay,
And
on the B mount.
Yeah.
And we already have buy-in from a lot of battery manufacturers that are going to make B-mount batteries. It's a sturdier mount. The connection is much more robust between the camera and the battery. There's communication between the camera and the battery. And the really cool thing is that there's also lighting equipment that will be able to use this. So you'll be able to get these B-mount batteries and power the camera, but also power a sky panel with it, for instance. So that's also gaining momentum, and this camera, as I said, by default will come with the B mount, the new one.
Would it be fair to say that this is probably one of ARRI's biggest challenges, developing a new sensor for the first time in like a long time? Is that something that's probably been like difficult for you guys to make sure that you get it right?
It is difficult, but only because the first sensor we developed, well, it's not the first, but the sensor in the Alexa was so darn good. That really has been the biggest challenge. That just turned out to be a brilliant, brilliant sensor. That is, in the Mini LF still to this day, I think is the sensor that gives you the best image of any product or any professional camera in the world. So we've always said, we're not going to come out with a new sensor unless it's as good or better than the current sensor. And I think we have achieved that goal. So I can't really wait to talk about the new camera, but not yet. We're working on the marketing campaign right now. There's some really cool stuff there. And yes, it's been really tricky. It's been really tricky working on a new sensor, making sure it's as good or better, wink, wink, than the current sensor. Yeah, it's been a big challenge. And and quite frankly, sensor design is voodoo. Sensor design is, let me just invest €1 million a year for 5 years, and it may not work out. It sounds really crazy, but that's the way it is.